They haven't had somewhere to sleep. Like,
shelters are insufficient.
People had a right to sleep in parks and to still receive full support from the government.
They were much more sympathetic than I would have expected.
Okay, hi guys. Today we are with Reese and Laurel. Laurel and Reese. Would you like to give us a bit of an introduction?
Yeah, sure. So today is the start of a new phase for Tent City and unhoused living in St. John's. After there was a violent sweep a year ago for a sustained tent city behind the Colonial Building, the community has pretty much been forced into isolation and hidden from the public. But today they're coming back and trying to make their presence known and making their demands heard.
So what really inspired the journey of you starting with Tent City? What really inspired you deciding that you guys were going to be the people to make this change and make this difference?
The issues in society have been ever present, and I'm lucky enough to be with some very kind-hearted people that see this and want to act on it. I think it comes from trying to be as intentional with living in society as possible. I am a parent and I am raising a child in the same space I live in, and when I notice there are injustices happening, I don't like the representation I would be for my child to not be trying to assist with that.
Tent City kind of came about through so many more processes and people than just Reese and I. I can't speak for you, Reese, but I stepped in when it was somewhat already formed by primarily unhoused folks and people who have that lived experience of being unhoused, deciding to come together and using their collective power and expertise to make some changes and do this in this I don't know, intentional community meets protest space or what have you. My previous work experience, I worked with unhoused folks, but it was in the nonprofit kind of charity-based model. And I left that for a big reason, which is those models are undignifying and oppressive and soul sucking. You hear about burnout and people use that word and they kind of toss that around and I'm tired or I'm fed up, but really there's this there's something that happens to you when you're being asked to and enacting things that are out of alignment with your ethical frameworks. And I think a lot of people working in nonprofit spaces go in because they think they can help people, and then the rules and the resources they're given, eventually you realize that in some ways you're harming people, and that's what I realized.
How did you make that realization? What was the point where you had that moment of oh wow, this is actually doing the opposite of what I wanted to do?
I mean, there's nothing more radicalizing than working in the lowest barrier shelter in BC or on Vancouver Island, in the middle of an opioid poisoning crisis meets the pandemic. So people that I loved and I cared for, and they were dying because of bad policies. There's really excellent evidence-based methods or supports or resources for supporting people who are using substances, for supporting people who are unhoused, and most of the people who are unhoused, they know these things as well, but government ignores us, the police ignore us. Anyways, long story short, I worked this awful job with really wonderful people, and I loved that community. Nowhere else made me feel more at home and have a sense of belonging, which doesn't really make sense. I'm still trying to make sense of it. But and then this Tent City popped up across the street from Reese and I. We were actually neighbors during the first iteration of Tent City. Yes. And I knew who was organizing it, and they were doing it so with such care and respect for the people who were actually living there and knew these things best and were most affected by homelessness and the decisions that people in power were making. And I knew that this was a way that I could I could like be involved in a community that I cared about in a way that aligned with my like ethics.
Let's talk about that for a second, actually, because when the former tent city was taken down, there were claims that there were a lot of like activities happening that was unsafe, and but you're saying like it was actually done with a lot of care for the people who inhabited the tent city.
I mean, like, both things are true. So, like, the folks like Reine and I and, like, the greater collective of people who we never really figured a name for ourselves, like the neighbors of Tent City or whatever.
That sounds badass, actually.
We tried our best to be careful and intentional. We practiced what we don't call it mutual aid. Smarter people than us call it mutual aid. And which isn't to say that we like didn't make big mistakes and that there weren't, like weird power imbalances and, us falling into the same patterns that you would in the charitable model.
Conflict.
Say again?
Conflict.
Yeah. So there was that. And then of course, like, you bring groups of people together who are like being denied their basic human rights, living in very stressful conditions, like with surveillance and police and like random people coming by all the time, and it's like freezing cold. Like, of course, like conflict and tensions are going to arise in those ways. So like, yes, there was violence. There was also like worse things happening. Like, I don't want to paint like what happened at Tent City with this like perfectly rosy like lens, like but Tent City isn't the answer to like the housing crisis either. People deserve more space in their own homes, and like people targeted Tent City in ways that like brought on like violence.
What do you feel is the source of this targeting?
Well, I think it really ties into your last comment about the violence that was present. That's a common framing we had the entire way through. It was how media and politicians presented it and how the police would report on it. And it's hard to take that with any credibility when these are the same individuals that would not recognize the systemic failures that happen that put people in such vulnerable positions that they end up living in very close quarters in a very hard way of living. Living in a tent through a St. John's winter is not an easy time. And then we would have quote unquote health checks by the first responders, law enforcement, with their guns ever present. And that is going to, always carrying a gun on the hip. And they would be very intimidating for everyone, volunteers, the protesters. And I think that is not considered violence in itself. And it's the same violence that actually gets used to conditionally prevent these people from accessing the few social supports that are around. So
can you expand on that?
Why is there such a guard around the supports that are around for these people?
Well, while there is certainly a capacity issue with housing, and even though shelters are insufficient, shelters are at capacity, housing is unavailable, there's limitations there, but there's also criteria there. There's conditions on how you must be present or what you must be as an individual to receive these services. It's almost the system telling on itself when media and government point out that it was unsafe here when the conditions were made by that from the systemic failures that are made by them.
Interestingly, just to add on to that, around the time of that first Tent City, the Federal Housing Advocate put out a series of like reports, one main one, some preliminary ones, about Tent Cities, because encampments were popping up all over the country. And her ultimate argument was that in the absence of safe, affordable, adequate housing, people had a right to sleep in parks and to still receive full support from the government. So tent cities are being swept up by the government and police all over, but actually, like, what they should be doing is instead of like pushing them away, like supporting them to be at least a temporary viable option for folks who like choose for very good reasons not to stay in the shelter system. But So far, I haven't seen the feds or the province acknowledge that it has been, declared a basic human right to have housing. And in the absence of that, then camping on public property should be allowed.
100%. I know that you mentioned that there would be like a new tent city starting up today, and then there is that fear around potential protesting and police stopping that. Could you elaborate a bit more?
So there's a few things we've done. This particular location was chosen on federal land. And the reason why that is the case is because it's really easy for the city to remove people. The colonial grounds were provincial, and that extra layer made it a little bit harder for people to kick us out. And our understanding is that the federal, like it being federal land, that just like jurisdictional extra layer and bureaucracy will make it slightly harder for them to take us off the land. So there's that. There's just like been some strategic thoughts about placement. There's like legal things, like we've talked to lawyers, and probably the strongest argument, despite the fact that it's someone's basic human right to like sleep where they can. The protest element, the freedom of speech element is supposed to be our like strongest kind of like protective measure as far as the law goes. But like ultimately, like both of those federal land and laws are like, deeply colonial, like flawed constructs. And I think the strongest thing that we have is like community. So a big reason why the turnout for that last sweep was as big as it was is because we had an emergency channel of, I don't know, dozens more of people we trusted. And we let them know as we had a feeling that the eventual sweep was coming. So we had people on standby to show up and help protect Tent City and people's belongings. Ultimately, like, people were there, but like there were so many cops. Like there wasn't a way of, putting bodies between cops and tents without it being really dangerous.
Yeah, let's switch gears and talk about mutual aid for a second. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, there is a misunderstanding that there are sufficient supports available, that the state is covering and making sure everyone's basic rights are covered. And that is simply not the case. As long as there are conditions on these basic rights for people, we need to exist. Tent cities need to exist. Survival methods need to exist. And I guess that's where mutual aid really, really stems from. And the limitations on those systems are so present for everyone, but especially the vulnerable. And I think we just need to be filling in the gaps that the state chooses not to.
The like idea of mutual aid is to be like practicing caring for each other and doing something better. Because if the state was suddenly overthrown, like, for example, like would we know how to take better care of each other than the state would? Like, maybe not. So there's this idea of just like figuring out how to practice care for one another, and also like this like really beautiful strategy to it. Like, in order for us to like come to this ideal better world, like it can't just be like people like Reese and I, like all of us together like need to be working towards this. And like you can't, like I can't expect my like unhoused neighbors to like show up to like meetings to like be like plotting like the revolution when like they haven't had somewhere to sleep. Like
that's actually very true.
We have so many people in society are technically constituents, but they don't even have the time or resources to vote, let alone, as we said, envision a better idea than the so-called democracy we live under. Yeah.
What do you think?
I think also like that's also like a device that's used to prevent growth and change. Because when you were saying like, this is the state of my life, this is what I'm experiencing, this is, and I don't like what society has created for me. People ask, so what do you want society to do? It's like, well, I haven't gone to that part yet. I'm still just suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying like, this is not it. So maybe people that are not suffering and not entirely disadvantaged by the situation can decide to help.
Yeah.
Like if I'm suffering and I have to do all the just philosophical heavy work and all the emotional heavy work and everything, that's part of that oppression.
Absolutely, yeah. I think there should be zero expectation on anyone of having the answers of what we do, what we can envision to make things better, when we can literally just say, take the boot off our neck right now.
Yeah.
There is so much pressure on individuals that we don't need to envision anything utopian. We just need to say, stop the harm right now.
Do you want to talk about like dealing with antagonist media?
Yeah, mainstream media has had a presence for Tent City. They do cover the story, but as Laurel, I'm sure, can attest to, as regularly having interviews, they do choose to cut out some of the main points we try to emphasize. Independent media here is wonderful and have really shown up and can identify with the public.
You know, we kind of expected that the government would like push back, and you know, we were making them look bad. So like it made sense that they would like kind of like, can I say,
Try to polish what you're saying to fit.
well, they would shit on us, but like they would they would kind of like construe our, like they kind of posed us as like these like barriers between resident protesters and homes, as if that those homes were on offer, and we were like, no, you got to stay in tents. But actually, like who I was like most like, I don't know, disappointed with were the large charitable organizations, without naming names because it's obvious enough. We also posed a threat to them, it turns out. So much of their viability and their funding comes off of them being able to tell the public and government that they are solving homelessness. And not only are they not doing that, but that's impossible because like charity is not designed to solve anything.
That's a strong statement.
Yeah, no, I want you to elaborate on that statement. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. I never really understood how much money and charities got from government or like very wealthy foundations until I started working for them myself, and so much of their ability to like maintain themselves and putting on those band-aids to these big structural problems is to be able to like show and prove that they're helping. But ultimately, you know, like charity is an important band-aid, but to actually address the housing crisis, like you need some big structural changes, and that is deeply disruptive to the status quo that, you know, government and you know, the charitable model rely on.
I researched and found about this place called Hennepin County and how they had like a multi-level strategy to prevent people from going homeless, because for what they say, like that's where the issue is people losing housing, losing that dignity, and then going into not just survival mode but like extreme survival mode, because once you're homeless, it's difficult for you to like pick up the pace and decide, oh, I want to get a job, because that's furthest from your mind. You know, to operate in society right now, you need a job. So like if that's not even on your radar, you cannot become a quote unquote member of society.
Yeah.
You know, and so they have like this different strategy. 10 cities was one of them. 10 cities, just different levels of housing before you got to the position where you're like, oh, I have a home, because that is like you said, a basic human right. You can't do anything without a home. Like you have to, and that's one of the things I thought about when I was reading about the articles and, you know, the unsafeness of Tent City. And something I read about was the fact that they're outside. A lot of us just have the privilege to do all the unsafe things that we do in our homes. You know, like a majority of people doing drugs are not homeless people. They actually house people. Majority of people that have domestic violence, they have like partner abuse, there are people in their homes. It's just that you can see homeless people when they do these things, and so it feels like a confirmation bias of like, this is the kind of people that are outside. And I think that's reinforced by this. I don't know who created it, because I've never had this conversation, but I've had to like work that belief out of myself that people that didn't work hard enough, other people that end up on the street, or people that have some kind of like drug defect or like how some kind of problem with those other people on the street, and it's like that's not quite the case. The situation we're in right now, there's no safeguards. Like you miss a couple paychecks and you're on the streets, right? And it's so surprising because once you're on the street, you have so much issues to worry about that even getting back to having a house is not, it's not easy.
It's not possible. Yeah. There's something like deeply pernicious about this idea, but like that if you're unhoused, it's your fault. But that is like kind of like the core of neoliberalism, like not to drop like big words, but like the rich people, like, oh my God, they're so smart and so talented and they deserve to like have like, multitudes more than the rest of us. But if you have nothing, it's probably because you made poor choices and you kind of deserve it. What's interesting is that, so working in shelters, like I saw a lot of people come in and experience homelessness for the first time. And they're often middle-aged men who still had their jobs. They just like, like something went wrong with like their housing, and they like for all logical purposes, they should be able to, or like, as far as how we understand the shelter system, they should be able to like keep working, stay in the shelter for a couple of weeks, and then be able to move back into housing. But like shelters are, dangerous, dirty, loud, and very quickly what I would see is these men's like mental health plummet because of like the stress and the conditions they were living in. And one survival tactic for living under such stress, especially like lack of safety, often people use substances to be able to stay awake and protect themselves and their belongings. So there's this idea that like people made bad choices, they decide to do drugs, and then they're homeless and it's kind of their fault. But oftentimes it's just like big systemic failures. People end up without housing, and they're making like really logical, rational choices. Like, I'm going to get assaulted if I don't like stay up and protect myself. So I'm going to use this like substance so I can stay up and do that. And that becomes like a really like devastating cycle. Like people don't come out of homelessness easy for a reason. It's because none of our support systems are actually adequate to support people out of them.
Do you feel like you faced any like individually as people like severe backlash or like hindrances in your personal life progress, like pursuing this?
I think what I found, and it was quite beautiful to be honest, was outside of the scope of the people that I was involved in Tent City with, I still have family and friends that were not involved, but they knew of my involvement. And although they were not participating, they were much more sympathetic than I would have expected. And I think we saw that on our social media, on our communications as well. We had a lot of support, and it varied in degrees. Some people were outspoken and open about it, but our donations were not always public. They would be anonymous. And there are people that I think connect with this, but there's that pressure to still keep up with the Joneses and think that this still needs to be fixed in some other way. Some professional will come along and fix this, and it's not going to be this ragtag group that's making mistakes but trying as we do.
I like that you said that, because I feel like there's been this like education of the masses where there's like learned helplessness, like there's an expectation of someone, there's an alienation of responsibility from each individual person as to what's going on in society, because there's so much like I would say negative things happening at the same time that you just have to numb yourself to a lot of these issues. And it's across the board, kind of like how you mentioned, it's like willful ignorance. Like people go out of the way to avoid this information because of how much oppressive the information is and how much all of this. But when they encounter someone like you or someone like Laura who's doing the work, there's a lot of like empathy there of like, oh my God, someone can do this and it's possible to get involved with community like this. How would you say someone can get involved with Tent City for community now?
Quickly to top up on your other point too is I think the antidote to that, like that sense of like helplessness or like overwhelmed by just like all of the like yeah the numbness of all of these problems in the world is like standing alongside community and doing something about it. Like yeah, like I've met like really wonderful friends through this work. I've like learned so much and experienced just like a lot of like joy and satisfaction and like hope through doing that work. Like I'd like to like puncture the idea that you know, like you like me or anyone else does this because we're like really what's altruistic or really selfless or whatever. Like fuck no, like this is like joyful, wonderful like work. And I mean, might not be for everyone, but I do believe that like surely most people like there's something wrong in the world, and being a part of addressing it will like bring you like something in return. Like there is like mutuality to that aid.
Yeah, I think there's an overall public complacency just with so many wrongs that are done. And we're talking about this topic that is very localized, but we're criticizing a government that is part of a system that is, while they're doing this to tents here, they're bombing tents in Gaza. Like this is a big problem that we are complacent with wholesale, but if we can connect with not with fighting that complicity and rejecting that we have to be complicit, then it can look like a tent city. It can look like the support there because we are rejecting that this is the way it is and we don't have the power to do anything about it besides voting every couple of years.
Yeah. And yeah, if someone wanted to get involved, all they have to do is get in touch. We like could really use the hands, always. Yeah, I think on Facebook and Instagram we're still Tent City for Change, St. John's, but we'll probably be Tent City for Community.
And I also second that anyone who is interested in helping out, the diversity of individuals we've had has been beautiful. I think whatever someone's skill is in their career, in their life, their personal skills, I'm sure there will be a way to help with this dilemma. We've got people who are out there doing the labor, people doing the logistics, people doing the internet communication and organizing the whole thing. There's so many things that can be done. So I guess anyone who has it in them that they want to help, we could find a way.
Primarily, it's been like a really like queer, racialized group of like powerhouse badass people. So I hope it, you know, I'd like to think we're like a pretty like welcoming and like friendly and like, you know, growth oriented in the sense of like, you know, like come join us and we'll learn together kind of group of people.
I love that. Well, thank you guys for coming and having this conversation with us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So interesting.
It was nice.
Hi everyone. So that was our conversation with Tent City for Change, now Tent City for Community. Don't forget we are raising money for Rebels at the Walls. So go to the link in the bio to donate to the GoFundMe, or go to the link to put in a bid for the auction, because this art that I'm creating right here will be auctioned to raise funds again for Rebels at the Walls. So please donate, please support. Thank you.